Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 11th Annual South Asia Media and Cultural Studies Conference. My name is John Mayo. I'm a faculty member here in the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy. Celebrating Voices is the theme of this year's hybrid conference, and we're especially pleased to welcome participants from South Asia as well as other regions via YouTube. Before introducing our keynote speaker, I wish to thank the College of Communication and Information, the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy, and the Center for Global Engagement for their support of our conference over the past decade. I also wish to thank the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Foundation of Miami for funding this event through an endowed lectureship in international affairs established here at FSU 18 years ago. We are privileged to have this year two distinguished keynote speakers address the conference. The first is Maher Nasser, Director of the Outreach Division in the United Nations Department of Global Communications. Mr. Nasser has over 37 years of experience in the UN system. He has held leadership positions on 4 continents, focused on communications, advocacy, external relations, and employee engagement. As director of the UN's outreach initiatives, he oversees partnerships with institutions and agencies in multiple sectors, including academia, civil society, libraries, and advertising. He's a very, very busy man. Mr. Nasser also has served the United Nations as Acting Undersecretary for Global Communications and as Commissioner General at 2 international expos, the first in Dubai in 2020 to 2022, the second upcoming in April of this year in Osaka, Japan. Mr. Nasser was born and raised in Palestine. He earned a BS in civil engineering from Birzat University in the West Bank, and a postgraduate diploma in business administration from the University of Warwick in the UK. In 2018, he was a visiting scholar at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. And in 2020, he received an honorary doctorate from De Montfort University, also in the UK. He received it for his lifelong dedication to human rights and sustainable development. Drawing upon his wide experience in international communications, Mr. Nasser will explore how transformative power of voice can advance a vision of the world which, in his words, everyone thrives in peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Nasser to FSU.
Good evening. I'd like to start by thanking Florida State University and the organizers of the 11th Annual South Asian Media and Cultural Studies Conference, and all the sponsors for putting together an impressive conference, and special thanks to Professor John Mayo and Assistant Provost Steve McDowell for an invitation for me to speak today and to share a perspective built on over 3.5 decades of working in the United Nations, mainly in communications, but also other things. Thanks also to all staff and volunteers whose contributions are invaluable in such events. And being one of the people who organize a lot of events in the UN, I know the effort that takes place behind the scenes, so thank you all. It was very inspiring this morning to see presentations from scholars in South Asia who were speaking to us close to midnight at their time and presenting key findings from their research and work to create positive change in their communities. It's always inspiring to see people working with their communities to effect positive change. When I read that the conference title was Celebrating Voices, I did the first thing any of you would do. I Googled what voices is. In the dictionary, the first entry was that as a noun, it is the sound of or sounds uttered through the mouth of living creatures, especially of human beings in speaking, shouting, singing, etc. I won't be shouting or singing here, so don't worry. These definitions, or this definition, exclude non-living creatures. With all the hype and mix of excitement and anxiety around artificial intelligence, AI, this is a good place to ask this distinguished audience of communications and media experts, can an AI have a voice? One could argue that based on what we have today and the above definition, an AI cannot have a voice, particularly, first, it doesn't have a mouth. And the versions of AI that we see today, large language models, LLMs, generative AI, they excel at generating human-like text based on processing and drawing on existing text with a massive computation power to identify patterns and produce text, images, and audio. at very high levels of complexity, but they cannot really go beyond that, or can they? What will the verdict be when the hypothetical artificial general intelligence, AGI, is here? I guess that is beyond the scope of this conference, but worth thinking about. As I was preparing for these remarks, it was tempting to use ChatGPT to write the speech. One of my colleagues actually suggested it. But in addition to that being cheating, and based on what I said earlier, using a tool that does not have a voice to speak about the power of voice would be a contradiction. But I did use ChatGPT for one part of these remarks, and we'll get to that later. In his best-selling book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, Yuval Noah Harari argues that the main reason humans, Homo sapiens, have been the most successful species in their ability to cooperate in large numbers is their ability to cooperate in large numbers. An ability that was only possible with the unique capacity to believe in things that do not exist. They exist only in our imagination, or in short, in stories, in narratives. Some research has shown that 90% of all human communication is based on storytelling. And that is how we humans are able to convey information and with that hope to change minds and behaviors. Businesses, brands, social movements, religions, political parties, and politicians achieve their success by being able to create a narrative around themselves that stand them out compared to others at that given time. The same narrative, the same story may not work or would have not worked 10 years before or 10 years from now. It has to be the right time. So stories and narratives matter, and that is why they have been part of the communication strategy at the United Nations. In today's interconnected world, to ensure that we reach audiences to fulfill the mandates given to us by member states, our success depends not only in using fact and science-based data and information, but in being able to convey these in a story arc that is relevant to the moment and is and seen as being authentic. In addition to authenticity, we know from surveys and research that people around the world are turning away from news in general. According to a report by Oxford University's Reuters Institute published in June 2024, almost 4 in 10 people worldwide said that they often actively avoid the news, compared to 29% in 2017. So the trend already started a few years back. They described the news as depressing, relentless, and boring. Not surprising, as many news outlets go with the adage if it bleeds, it leads. So no wonder. In 2013, a group of award-winning journalists in New York established a solutions journalism network to lead a global shift in journalism that is focused on advancing rigorous reporting about how people are trying to solve problems and what we can learn from their successes and failures. The network has trained over 57,000 journalists to date. As defined on their website, solutions journalism includes the following key elements: response, insight, evidence, and limitations. Basically, it's not enough to describe the problem and show the challenge. You need to show the solution, and if possible, how people got around it, what worked, what didn't work, what were the lessons learned, and then people will see not just the problem, but also the solution. They have found that when people read an article that is not only featuring a problem, but also how a solution was addressed with successes and failures, they come back for more. In short, it's not enough to highlight the problem or the challenge. We need to also show a solution or give the reader, viewer, an opportunity to learn from the solutions and to be part of that solution. So building on that, since 2020, at the Department of Global Communications, our global communications strategy has been guided by the solutions network work, but also by what we call the 3 Ws: the what, the why care, and what now. What is that we need to lead the narrative by providing timely, authoritative information on UN priority issues. Why care? We design storytelling communication that get target audiences to care, to proactively reach them on platforms that they use. What now is by developing campaigns and content that highlight solutions and encourage specific actions. And underlining all of this is a focus on promoting information integrity. Let's talk about some of the things that we have been doing using this as background. This year, 2025, the UN turns 80. The UN was created and came to exist. The first charter was signed on 26th of June, 1945 in San Francisco. The UN came to be when all members ratified, and it came to exist on the 24th of October, 1945. So the UN is an organization that has had a great impact on my own life and that of hundreds of millions of people around the world, including a quarter of humanity that now live in South Asia. South Asia is home to over 2 billion people out of the planet's 8 billion. It's the region of the world that is the focus of this conference. The United Nations has been in my life directly since I was 5 years old. As a child of Palestine refugees, I attended school run by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, otherwise known as UNRWA. I received a scholarship towards my university fees, also from UNRWA, and subsequently joined UNRWA as a public information officer in Gaza in 1987, and have since worked and lived in Jerusalem, in Amman, in Gaza, of course, Jerusalem, Amman, Vienna, Cairo, Dubai, and New York. There are thousands of people whose life was changed and who created a career and a future in part thanks to the United Nations or one of its entities. And these examples often have more impact on people's perceptions than reading texts about treaties and resolutions. I personally always liked stories. I learned my English watching television. Reading stories, watching television, telling stories, briefing people about the films that I saw was something I enjoyed. And that's probably why I never worked as a civil engineer. My training, I can't tell a brick a story or cement. I found success in communications. I also found an alignment between the values that I grew up with, values anchored in a quest for peace, dignity, freedom, prosperity, and justice, and those enshrined in the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. UN entities who are working to save lives through humanitarian interventions, and the same can be said of other organizations, not just the UN organizations, do not rely on numbers to create empathy and raise funds and support for their operations and protection for the vulnerable. Whether they are refugees, displaced people, children, women, minorities, they rely on human-centered stories that are more able to touch people in ways that statistics and tables cannot. Numbers and statistics are people with their tears dried out, is something that my colleague Melissa often says. And when they do tell stories, they ensure that those stories are told without undermining the dignity of the subjects, the people in the story. They cannot be exploitative or undermine the right of those in the story to privacy and confidentiality. During the time I was in Dubai as the Commissioner General of the UN at Expo, I worked with a group of dedicated storytellers who were developing a platform for global advocacy and outreach called Dignified Storytelling that aimed to fostering a shared understanding and a practice of storytelling that upholds and accelerates and celebrates the dignity of all persons. As we rely more on stories, these principles become even more important. But what about communicating about issues that cannot be tied or linked to a human story? I think we need to create a story arc that can generate that connection. In relevant terms, the United Nations 80 this year is relatively a very young organization in the world that we live in. While it is not perfect, and I can agree with anybody who's going to tell me the UN is not perfect, it is not. It remains a beacon of hope with the bold premise that dialogue and engagement are better than war and conflict, and that by working together, we can create a world in which everyone thrives in peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet. In a quote that is famously attributed to Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General, which cannot actually be his voice, because the quote, the full quote from Dag Hammarskjöld is, "It is often said that the UN was not created to bring us to heaven, but to save us from hell." Some historians say that that was actually first said by a US ambassador, and then that's what Dag Hammarskjöld was quoting. But if you Google it, you will find often that it is tied to Dag Hammarskjöld. His or not, it remains the true reflection of the UN's role then and today. Current headlines aside, over the past 80 years, and through its mediation work, peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building, the United Nations has saved countless people from the hell of war and displacement, from disease, and from injustice. It presents a framework for norm setting on a global scale through resolutions that become conventions and treaties, setting standards that enable global trade, communications, and travel to take place safely. And its work contributes to averting famine, preventing nuclear proliferation, containing or even eradicating diseases like what we did with smallpox, collaborating in dealing with climate change, the ozone layer depletion, educating millions of children, and more. But we also recognize that the world today is very different from the one in which the UN was born in 1945. UN membership has grown from 51 to 193. The world's population has almost quadrupled. When the UN was created, there were 2.3 billion people on the planet. Now we have 8.2 billion. The majority of humans were living in rural areas. A minority were living in urban centers. Today, more people live in cities and urban centers than villages. Yet, these changes have not been reflected in today's UN. While the General Assembly is seen as the most representative and deliberative organ of the organization, serving as humanity's town hall, the Security Council is now seen as unrepresentative of the world today, with 5 countries wielding veto power over critical issues of peace and security. The same can be said of the global financial institutions. They have not kept up with the changes of the world today. Last September, at the Summit of the Future, that was held at the United Nations, member states adopted a pact for the future that included provisions that would start a process and discussions to expand the Security Council, to reform the international financial system, and to put global governance of the era around AI in place. How did we tell that story? When I tell that story, we don't start with the Pact for the Future or tell about the Summit of the Future. We start with the UN 75. In 2020, the UN turned 75 years old, and the Secretary General tasked us and a special team, said, we don't want to celebrate. Let's look at this point in history as a moment of reflection. Let's engage in a global dialogue and ask people, young people, old people, what is the shape of the world and the UN that they'd like to see in the year 2045, when we turn 100. That global exercise of listening was set back a little bit by COVID. So most of it took place online, but still they managed to reach one or more community in every member state and observer state. That report that was submitted by the Secretary General to the member states was called Our Common Agenda. And in Our Common Agenda, it was proposed to have a summit of the future, to look at how we can address the shortages in the UN and the current system to remedy the disconnect between the values that were relevant in 1945 and the organization and the changes, and how do we keep up with that. UN 75 was observed under the theme of shaping our future together. So when we now talk about UN 80, we say we have done the shaping with the Pact for the Future, the Global Digital Compact, another document adopted last September, and a declaration on future generations. And now let's use the UN 80 for building our future together. So that's how we connect the two and the narrative and put the Summit of the Future in the middle. The same can be said about Sustainable Development Goals. The UN meets regularly, member states meet regularly, but in September we welcome all world leaders. Sometimes they all come, sometimes 90% come, but almost more than 80% always come. And people who live Midtown Manhattan East, they hate that week. Traffic comes to a standstill almost, especially when a head of state or the president of the US is visiting. There's a total freeze, you can't move. But beyond that, not many people remember or what was significant about what was adopted in 2014, 2013, 2012, 2017, 17, etc. But in 2015, what we tried to make it different. So the narrative arc for 2015 is that we started talking about it from 2012. In 2012, at the Rio +20 conference on environment, they started talking about the need to create a sustainable development framework in September of 2015. So the UN and its partners, we launched a campaign called The World We Want that included reaching out to about 1 million people. What would you want to see in this agenda? Civil society consultations, conference, other engagement, intensive negotiations by member states led by co-sponsors, Kenya and Ireland. And eventually, at the Sustainable Development Summit in September 2015, world leaders adopted by consensus the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So when we talk about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we talk about them as having come and being an accumulation of all the participation, the groundswell of ideas coming from all over the world. So that gives them legitimacy. And they have been one of the most popular outcomes from the United Nations in decades. I don't know how many of you have noticed this pin, or maybe some of you have have it. It represents the Sustainable Development Goals. The adopted text, if you read it, it's written in what we call UNese, like the same language of UN resolutions. But if it was left to that, I doubt that it would have reached the level of familiarity and support that the SDGs have today. Working with partners from the creative world, a short text was developed with the colorful icons, each representing one SDG, were developed and launched in September, along with a visual projection on the UN building, creating iconic images that inspired audiences that this was an agenda to end poverty, zero hunger, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity and equality for all by 2030. And that it was not an agenda for governments alone to achieve. It was an agenda for all of us, individuals, businesses, universities, civil society, and governments. We all have a responsibility to achieve it. Historically, and to reach audiences beyond those reached by our own platforms, publications, websites, social media, press conferences, the United Nations has often used celebrities to amplify the messaging and advocacy for the issues on the UN's agenda and priorities. The UN has also had a long and established tradition of engaging with civil society, either through the Economic and Social Council, which accredits NGOs with consultative status, or through our own department that we associate NGOs that have a communication component and work with them to advocate for and share the issues on our agenda. In November 2010, we took another step by creating a platform to engage directly with academic institutions and universities. We launched the United Nations Academic Impact, an initiative that taps into the intellectual social responsibility of universities. It invites members to commit to a number of principles that are aligned with the Charter of the UN, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, sustainability, labor laws, etc. UNAI has now over 1,700 member universities in more than 130 countries. Last summer, we issued a call to all members to express interest in becoming a chair or a vice chair for one of the 17 hubs, each aligned with one of the SDGs. The response was overwhelming, with more than 300 universities expressing interest. And last week, we announced the selected 20 chairs and co-chairs and are now in the process of identifying vice chairs for research, partnership, and education for each of the 17 hubs. And we welcome Florida State University to consider joining us in this effort. In addition to civil society, academia, and celebrities, we recognize that there is a greater potential to have wider and stronger impact by working with the creative community in incorporating issues in films and television productions along the lines that Norman Lear spearheaded in Hollywood Health and Society Initiative at the US Annenberg Norman Lear Center. The creative industry excels at telling stories, and we have reached out to them to help tell stories of our issues. Not like advertising, not like public service announcements, but to incorporate those in the production of the films, in the narrative, in the stories. And there are many examples that you can actually find on our Creative Community Outreach Initiative page. Following the adoption of the SDGs, we worked with Sunny Entertainment on a series of short videos and clips with characters from the film Angry Birds. Later, also the Smurfs, to popularize the SDGs and promote the ideas of individual action that people can take to reduce waste, their carbon footprint, and more. In Japan, we worked with Sanrio and their most popular character, Hello Kitty. Yep, somebody's been paying attention. On a series of videos in which Hello Kitty would focus on one SDG in partnership with the most relevant UN entity. We also worked with Mattel, who at the time had recently purchased Thomas the Tank Engine. Anybody knows Thomas the Tank Engine? Yeah, the famous children's train character. They were developing a new series that incorporated, in collaboration with us, elements from the SDGs into that season, accompanied by short videos with tutorials for parents and educators to simplify and introduce concepts within the SDGs to children, gender equality, such as gender equality, responsible production and consumption, quality education and health, climate change, and more. Look up All Aboard for the Global Goals. United Nations Thomas and Friends launched the SDG collaboration, and you can see some of those videos online. One of my first asks when we met with them was that if you want this new season to be aligned and close to the SDGs, most of your train, except one, are male trains. You need to have more female trains, and they need to be as strong and as powerful as male trains, and that's what happened. Simple concept, simple for children. In 2016, the 6 holding companies of all the advertising industry, they own majority of advertising agencies in the world, came together in Cannes at the Cannes Lions Festival of Creativity, and they met with the Secretary-General, Ban Ki-moon at the time, and they launched an initiative that they said is aimed to support the SDGs, Common Ground. And they basically said, we never come together in one room because we are fierce competitors. We hate each other. We fight with one another, but we have come here to say we want to launch Common Ground, that our common ground is supporting the SDGs. And we have worked with them for a number of years on pro bono campaigns that they launched for selective SDGs. I always challenged them. I said, You want to help us talk about gender equality, climate change, good health, education, fighting hunger and poverty. But what about SDG 12, responsible production and consumption? You are part of the problem. So when we partner with also other entities, we do not shy away from telling them what they're doing wrong as well. More recently, we launched a new initiative that aims to build on the massive popularity of football. And I guess for this audience, soccer, and the global audience of fans that reaches 3 to 4 billion people on the planet. We wanted to leverage the industry's reach and impact in fostering support for priority issues on the UN's agenda, from sustainability policies and practices to advocacy for and implementation of the SDGs, equality, ensuring equality, reducing inequalities, human rights, and fighting racism and climate action. Since we launched it in July of 2022, all the 6 regional football confederations have joined, along with over 330 national football federations, leagues, professional and amateur clubs, foundations, media entities, and civil society organizations. This is where I will read the part that ChatGPT suggested. At Florida State University, the power of voice has been a crucial tool in driving change, from student-led activism to sustainability efforts, from media advocacy to supporting diversity in STEM. Communication is a tool for social, cultural, and environmental transformation. And these examples show that when students use their voice with purpose and commitment, they can change the future. Your voices as students of this institution are just as powerful as the voices of those who have come before you. And the same potential that sparked change on this campus can continue to be a force for good as you take on the challenge of opportunities of the world beyond FSU. Keep speaking, keep listening, and keep fighting for the change you believe in. I guess we can give AI the right to have a voice.
Mr. Nasser will now take questions. Anybody have?
I think there's a roaming microphone, so if you want to ask a question, please.
Hello. I wanted to ask you, what has been your favorite thing you've done while being at UN?
What is my
Favorite thing that you've done while being at UN?
Oh God, there's so many. It's 37 years. See. I think sometimes just changing one thing for one person is enough. But to be honest, seeing you heard what I do, I enjoy every bit of it because I'm not stuck doing the boring stuff. Some people will not like me saying some of the stuff that they do is boring, but the opportunity to work with the creative community, to engage with civil society, to be able to do things that some people think, my God, the UN had three-body problem film at the UN. Things like that. I think these are interesting. But if I want to go back, I actually go back to my first few years when I worked with UNRWA in Gaza and seeing the actual change that the education, health, and social services did to people's lives. And to be part of that is the most rewarding part of my journey.
Hi. My question is, like you said, by 2030, our SDG goals, maybe we'll be reevaluating the progress and everything. But with the AI that you touched upon and the uncertainty around how the world is shaping, with your expertise of 37 years, what do you see beyond 2030 and the role of UN in general in shaping the world and celebrating voices?
Well, thank you. I think on the SDG agenda, the reality is every July, the Secretary General publishes a report prepared by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs with the input from everyone, shows where we are in achieving it, and we are way off track. Only 17 to 18% of the goals are on track, and the rest are not on track. Last year, which was the midpoint, we had a campaign that borrowed from a sports example, is that we are midterm, where this is the halftime. So has any football game been lost in the first half? No, it's always the second half that is the deciding factor. So let's double down, let's do more, and maybe AI can help us find solutions. So we're not giving up on the 2030 agenda, and this is why there's an avoidance to discuss what comes after, because once you start doing that, then you forget about the focus on the SDGs themselves. Now, this is something that we cannot ignore, the impact of COVID. The pandemic had a great impact around the world. The war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, had another push of the raising prices of food and energy globally during that period that had pushed people into poverty. For the first time, 2022, the number of people living in extreme poverty increased for the first time between 1990 and 2021. We have seen a massive reduction in people living in extreme poverty. Just to take another example, in 1990, 43% of the world's population were living in extreme poverty. In 2021, 2022, it's actually down to 11%. So there is progress. We know that when you set goals and objectives, it works. But then if you only rely on governments, and those governments change leadership, and then they change and they say, we're not going to do this again, we will even be less successful in achieving them. The SDG and the SDG agenda needs to become about everybody's business, because it's not about what was agreed by world leaders, but what makes sense. It's an investment in a future that will benefit everyone. And I think that's what the argument is. The Pact for the Future tried to address some of the challenges of that the UN is set up, needs to change to reflect the world of today, not the world of 1945. And I think that, I mentioned briefly the financial institutions. Financial institutions today, countries in sub-Saharan Africa pay more for debt servicing than they can afford to invest in health, education, and infrastructure combined. And what they pay in interest payments is unfavorable to them. It's 8 times, our Secretary General has used this statistic multiple times. A country in Africa, they borrow from the international financial markets. The interest rate that they pay, or they have to pay, is 8 times more than if Portugal, his own country, borrowed on that. That cycle needs to change.
Hi. Thank you for your talk tonight. Early on you mentioned that journalism can become even more effective when solutions are incorporated in reporting on the problem. Communication can be a little different than journalism, but several of us in the room work in environmental communication. And I find that with environmental scientists, sometimes they're nervous to talk about solutions because with environmental questions, there's often many. And so it's hard to identify a few to mention. And then on the other side, sometimes with decision makers and politicians, it's also hard to put solutions out there because that can cause a lot of complicated problems. And so do you have any advice to communicators on how to navigate that situation?
I think whatever you communicate and whatever you communicated, the first thing you have to put in your mind is, who is my audience? And who is the auxiliary audience that is also listening, maybe not my primary audience, but will pay attention to what I say for whatever reasons. And then you have to develop the messaging and the campaign mainly targeting your audience, but being aware of what others around it, because we don't live in a vacuum. And try to get to the best of it. Listening to an audience, listening to whoever you want to reach through social media listening or utilizing other tools, or sometimes engaging in focus groups helps. These are some of the things that we have done, and we try to pay attention. Being the UN, we have 193 member states. Each of them has its own priorities. Each of them, I mean, many of them agree on general things, but when we have collective campaigns, we have to pay attention to every one of them. A few years back, we don't usually delete tweets once we in the corporate accounts, but there was a tweet that said, "Don't eat red meat. Red meat production harms the environment," and several missions called to say, by which report from the UN expert body that you say this, and our country depends on production of red meat, and this is counter to whatever. So because it was based on a report from an NGO, not a UN body, we said, okay, we'll delete it. But that gives you an example of sometimes the level of sensitivity that we have to pay attention to.
Hello, this is JJ Lee. I'm an associate professor in communication. I teach marketing communication here at FSU for more than a decade. One of the things that I really appreciate about your presentation is your efforts to make it more friendly for the younger children, using a lot of characters, including Rio and Mattel and so on. Which is really, I think, really an idea. But at the same time, have you, in your marketing communication team, ever thought about making your own branding for SDG goals 2030? Not using others, because already established brands may have their own, who and on, good or bad images on in a certain level, right? So. My question here is, have you ever thought about, because recently UNICEF announced that their new backpack kind of mascot for their education, global education team. So I think have you ever considered to make your own brand with the image or mascot, or do you have any plans for the future?
I mean, our challenge is UNICEF and other UN agencies that are primarily funded through voluntary contributions and their budgets in the billions of dollars. They actually invest quite a bit in marketing and campaigns that go beyond what we can do in the UN Secretariat Department of Global Communications, because, let's say UNICEF, 60% of UNICEF's income or donations come to UNICEF from individuals and the private sector. In the UN Secretariat, where I work, our budget is fully funded by the assessed contributions from the member states. So the Secretary General presents a budget of $3 billion this year to member states and says, I need this much for the Department of Peacekeeping Political Affairs, this much for Department of Economic and Social Affairs, this much for Department of Global Communications. And then the US government pays 22% of that when they pay. China this year will go up to pay 20%. Then comes Japan, then Germany, and then every single member state has to chip in. So we have that budget. But how we spend that money is detailed in the submission that we have sent to them and has to be approved by what we call the fifth committee, and before that something called the ACABQ, Administrative Committee on Budgetary Questions. And the bulk of our budget is actually salaries. So we have no other component to play with and hiring other and to produce our own, but we do. I mean, Our video production unit does that. But sometimes I think the partnership, for me, attractive part of it is that you get ownership from another group, and they are as invested in pushing it out as you are. And we don't sign up with anyone. I mean, the most difficult part is actually negotiating the memorandum of understanding, which involves our legal department, the ensuring that the use of the name of the UN, the emblem of the UN, are like very, very strict. But this is why the SDGs gave us a bit of a leeway. The SDGs, we have a version of it without the UN emblem. And the guidelines say that if you want to use the SDG emblem, whether it's this or the icons, for advocacy purposes, not to make money, not for profit, but please do. For educational advocacy, please do, but not with the UN emblem. So this is why the SDGs have become a good tool for us.
Hello, I'm Shubho. I'm from Bangladesh, so I'm studying PhD communication here.
I'm trying to find where, feeling I'm interrogated, but this is why I'm saying here, because this is the least, so don't worry. Go ahead.
Okay. So I work as a communication focal person in our country for Citizens Platform for SDGs. So that was started in 2016. So when we were talking about SDGs, I was going back to that time. Goal 17 is partnership, 16 for peace. So I was going to everything. And my question would be on political narrative issue. So what I saw that MDG was 8 goals there. SDGs has 17. So I'm quite sure that by 2030 there will be 5, 6 more will be added. What happens is that first 5 years goes for raising apprehension, next 5 years goes for planning for project, and then next 5 years goes for implementing. And always there are governments in our country or South Asian country, they don't quite like the push they get from the UN. So the political narratives always settle down.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see when we are translating the SDGs in our Bangla language, there is no official translation from the UN. So we have to translate by our own by 2018. So government didn't like that. So when you say leave no one behind, so who is the no one? Do we consider transgender people as no one or children as no one? So they actually fight with us. So don't put these people in your list. So when I feel like that UN sometimes get delayed making those political correction and making those translation for proper communication. But when it's democracy, people actually have the right to be the majority to dictate the translation, right? You can see in different parts of the country.
Mm-hmm.
So how we were going to tackle this when it will be coming for next phase of SDGs, other development goals.
I'm glad you mentioned the MDGs. The Millennium Development Goals were not actually adopted in the same way as the SDGs. In 2000, at the Millennium Summit, world leaders adopted the Millennium Declaration. It did not have Millennium Development Goals. It was not broken down. It was actually a group of the administrator of the UNDP, the Secretary-General Kofi Annan, other people in his office. Then they basically took from within the Millennium Declaration and came out and saying, oh, this means 8 MDGs, and the UN ran with it. And some member states did not actually like that. They said, wait, we never agreed to that. This is not something that we have endorsed. But eventually, it just continued. That's why we did the campaign to build up before the SDGs, so that we can say this is actually the world's agenda. It's not just, and be authentic by saying that. Now, the UN has 6 official languages. Unfortunately, Bangla, Urdu, Hindi are not among them, Portuguese, and others. But we do, wherever possible, we have UN information centers that are part of our department in 59 countries. And they do have they do build local versions, and they translate to the extent possible to those languages. We have the UN resident coordinator, UN country teams. We also work with them where we don't have UN information centers. And it is that country effort, and I think it's easier to work with the UN country office than with somebody from headquarters. We don't have a mandate to work in the different countries, and we don't have a contact. Our contact is with the mission. That's totally different. You need somebody who is in the country because they work with the government. So I think that's where you need to really work with what and how the beyond 2030 agenda will look like. I don't have a, what do you call it? I can't look into the future. Crystal ball. So, and I don't know, I don't think I will be with the UN by then, but I will care.
Hi, I would like to ask a question on behalf of Dr. Bibo Dewanji. He's at the University of Kansas. He's one of our organizing committee members. Dr. Dewanji says, thank you for your thought-provoking address on the transformative power of voice. Many of the SDGs rely on increasing access to information and empowering local communities. How do you see artificial intelligence being used to amplify the voices, especially those of marginalized groups in South Asia, such as indigenous communities? Are there any innovative AI-driven communication initiatives that are showing promise? Thank you.
Let me ask ChatGPT. I think, I mean, for the most part, AI, people refer to it with anxiety, and I think there are quite legitimate reasons to be concerned about where this technology is going, and the absence of guardrails is sometimes the reason for that anxiety. At the same time, there's a great potential in these massive computational capacity that an AI can do, that we can probably fast track some solutions that we wouldn't have imagined. An example, when I have served as a jury member on the SDG Cannes Lion Festival of Creativity, the SDG Lions, and one of the submissions was airplanes, and you see sometimes the car trail, the trail that is behind the flight, the plane. I forgot the name.
Trail.
No, it has it. Yes, contrails. They account for 30% of the industry contribution to climate change, to greenhouse gas emissions. Through AI, they calculated that the reason contrails occur is when the plane is flying through an area of high humidity, the coming out hot air, that's what's created the contrail. So through a joint program between Google and American Airlines, they were able to identify flight path for airplanes that they experimented with and were very successful, that eliminated 90% of that. So that couldn't have been possible without AI. And I think that's one example of a solution that I think we can probably identify more.
Hi, my question is, how does the differences in different cultures and their beliefs and behaviors affect how you communicate to them and with like your voice when you're working on like SDGs and such?
I think I go back to the first answer to the question about audience. We are mindful that whatever communication campaign that we are developing, we have to be and put the audience as the first check for us. Cultural differences, linguistic differences, age differences do matter, because you don't want to do a campaign that will be misconstrued as being insensitive, and that will make it unauthentic, and then you could have a backlash. And I have an example, but I won't use it now. I can tell it to you later.
One more question. Over here.
Thank you again for coming today and for your inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. I'm on the College of Communication and Information, and I mainly do philanthropic work. So my question really is, with all the students here in this program, in this audience, one of the questions that I'm always interested in when we have presenters and speakers is about your career path. Obviously, so can you tell us a little bit more about being a civil engineer, right, was your degree?
Yeah.
But how did you get into your path where you are now, from being a civil engineer and now working with the UN? What opportunities presented itself? What opportunities did you identify that you leveraged? And who inspired you to have a mentor along your career path, and how did that work out for you?
Do you have time?
1 minute.
No, I mean, in the Middle East, and I think the same thing is probably in South Asia, if you're good at school, your parents, your neighbors, your relatives will expect you to be a doctor or an engineer. In some communities, maybe a lawyer. And I did well in school. So I was accepted as an engineer in Birzeit University, the first university in Palestine. I went there, and one of the title of this conference is Media and Cultural Studies. There was a university requirement that every student, no matter what they are studying, science, literature, arts, engineering, had to do 4 courses of cultural studies. And those were borrowed from an American university. The first volume was mainly focusing on the history of philosophy and also studying the Iliad, Gilgamesh, and all of those and their contribution to humanity's understanding of life and the world. Then you go into next stage, Middle Ages, the Islamic Renaissance, and then modern philosophy, Marx, Engels, and Descartes, and all of these people. And I loved those 4 courses more than anything I studied in the engineering. And that's what stuck with me. And like I said before, I also liked watching a lot of television programming. And in the Middle East, at least where I grew up, they don't dub television. So they leave the program as they are and they do subtitles, which is the best way to learn a language. That's why you find Dutch people speak better English than French people. And the same in other places. So when I finished my degree, it was faster for me to do my degree than to shift to study something else. I mean, my passion was political science, economics to some extent, literature, philosophy. But my parents would probably kick me out if I didn't graduate as an engineer. And I did it. I graduated as an engineer. I also had a scholarship from UNRWA to study engineering, so I would have lost that scholarship. So I finished the degree, and part of that, I was using my English to supplement my income by translating affidavits, leaflets for a human rights organization in Ramallah and Jerusalem. And then when I left, I had an offer to work as a training engineer or to work with this NGO in Jerusalem, and I had no hesitation. I started the work in Jerusalem. 2 years in, I see an ad in the paper that UNRWA was looking for a public information officer in Gaza. In those days, you can get in a car from Ramallah and you can get to Gaza in 1.5 hours. This is an impossible journey today and has been impossible for 30 years. I wanted to be in Gaza because I had read a report about the conditions in Gaza in 1987, that it was ripe for an explosion. Being 24 years old, curious and crazy maybe, I wanted to be there and witness that explosion. And that explosion was the first Palestinian Intifada in December 1987. It started there. So my initial desire was to go to Gaza for a year or 2. But then my work in Gaza became so busy and so fulfilling because every journalist, every politician, every delegation that came to see Gaza at the time came to UNRWA, came to me, and I was taking them out and showing them what was going on and the back end of why this thing happened and the reality and the services. And that remains, for me, the most fulfilling part of my career. And I stuck with it, I guess. I like the UN. And that's where I met my wife, who was a young British graduate who spoke fluent Arabic, was teaching English in Gaza. We met in '87, and we got married in '91.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights about communication and especially storytelling, for the marvelous update on the SDGs and their importance, and your personal story. Really grateful. Particularly those of you who didn't get your questions addressed, I don't think you would mind if they came forward
Please.
afterward. And I just want to close this afternoon's session. You may remember in my introduction, I said we were especially privileged this year to have 2 keynote speakers for our conference. The second one will be tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock in this room, and our speaker will be Ms. Farah Amr from the Asia Society. Here she is. So we'll have another great talk tomorrow afternoon. I hope as many of you as possible will return at that time. And thank you for coming this afternoon.
I don't know if this is a tradition or not, but can we have a group photo? No?
Of course.